Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into a world you might think you know. The castles, the knights, the banners snapping in the wind. But we're slipping quietly behind the heavy wooden doors where polite chronicles dared not tread. A bustling late medieval town square with merchants, townsfolk, and church bells in the distance. Shadows fall long across cobblestone streets, hinting at hidden stories behind smiling faces. An adulterer in ragged clothes paraded through the street villagers, jeering some banging pots. A man rides backward on a donkey, holding a broom. Women gossip nearby. A condemned figure kneels grimacing as a heated iron is pressed to their thigh. Onlookers watch with mixed fascination and judgment. Tonight we're talking about the most horrific sexual practices of the medieval world, and you probably won't survive this without squirming. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see just how far this strange little journey reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin in the shadowy halls of late medieval Europe, when notions of sin, salvation, and flesh had been braided into a single rope. The church, wielding near absolute authority over morality, saw the human body as a battlefield between God and the devil. Sexual acts were not just personal choices. They were declarations of loyalty in a cosmic war. This meant that deviations, whether real or imagined, were policed with a severity that could turn private intimacy into a matter of public spectacle and even judicial torture. The first horrific truth is that much of what we now think of as perverse was not necessarily driven by desire, but by punishment and fear. For example, there was the public shaming of adulterers, sometimes stripped to the waist, sometimes entirely naked, paraded through the streets in a humiliating walk of penance. In some towns, men were forced to wear women's clothing as they shuffled along to the jeers of neighbors. Women, conversely, might be forced into revealing garments that left no doubt about the nature of their crime. This wasn't titillation for the audience. It was cruelty masquerading as moral correction. But shaming could turn physical in ways that mingled sexual humiliation with outright violence. One notorious punishment for so-called carnal sins involved the application of heated metal brands pressed to the flesh, in visible sensitive areas, sometimes even on the inner thigh or pubic region. The victim carried that mark for life, a permanent advertisement of their vice. Imagine the dread of knowing that your body was no longer entirely your own, that it bore the stamp of public judgment forever. Another strange intersection of sex and cruelty came from the church's obsession with rooting out what they called sodomy, a broad term at the time that included homosexual acts, certain heterosexual acts, and anything else that strayed from the rigid definition of marital intercourse for procreation. Inquisitors and moral enforcers were trained disturbingly to interrogate suspects in explicit detail. Some records describe forced examinations, searches of the body for marks of witchcraft or evidence of unnatural acts. These were conducted under the guise of holy investigation, but they were invasive, degrading, and often deeply sexual in their violation. Of course, the medieval imagination was also fertile ground for superstition about the sexual body. One bizarre and unsettling belief was that certain physical deformities or moles indicated lechery or moral weakness. Midwives, healers, and even barbers were sometimes pressed into service as amateur moral inspectors, instructed to search bodies for sin spots. The person being examined might be restrained, held under torchlight, stripped and prodded, while their supposed moral worth was discussed as though they weren't even there. And then there was the practice, both judicial and extrajudicial, of using sexual violence as a weapon of power. Medieval chronicles, though often discreet in their language, make it clear that during times of war, sieges, and peasant uprisings, women, and sometimes men, were subject to organized sexual assault. This was not mere brutality in the chaos of conflict. It was a recognized method of breaking morale and asserting dominance over conquered people. Victims might be forced into the center of the village, assaulted publicly, to humiliate not only them, but their families and communities. Another particularly grim custom involved punishments designed specifically to attack reproductive capacity. For women accused of infidelity or illicit pregnancy, there were recorded cases, rare but chilling, of forced miscarriages induced by physical abuse, starvation, or even herbal poisons administered under the guise of purgatives. For men, mutilation of the genitals was sometimes inflicted as a sentence for rape, sodomy, or even consensual acts outside marriage. The body became the courtroom, the prison, and the execution site all in one. But it wasn't always the law doing the harm. Local customs, often unrecorded by the official scribes, could be just as cruel. In some rural regions, young men who pursued women outside their social rank could find themselves subjected to gang humiliation, stripped bound, and forced to crawl through the village while enduring taunts about their improper lust. The sexual element was inseparable from the punishment. The goal was to degrade the man's desire as much as his person. We also have to talk about the spectacle of punishment in medieval carnivals and festivals. There were sanctioned times of misrule when ordinary norms were inverted, and during these sexual humiliation could be played out publicly in a grotesque parody of romance or marriage. People accused of sexual impropriety might be forced into mock weddings, often between two men, or between a visibly unwilling couple made to kiss, grope, and stumble together for the amusement of the crowd. Though framed as comedy, these spectacles could leave lifelong scars of shame. And hovering over all of this was the omnipresent fear of eternal damnation. Medieval manuals for confessors laid out exhaustive lists of possible sexual sins, many of them minute in detail. Parishioners were grilled on whether they had touched themselves or others, in what manner, and with what intention. Priests might require the penitent to describe these acts in detail, not only deepening the shame, but creating a disturbing record in which the Church effectively preserved people's most intimate humiliations. When you put yourself in that world, a place where your body was constantly under surveillance, where desire itself was suspect, and where public degradation could be your fate for a whispered accusation, you begin to see why sexuality in the medieval era could become so twisted, so infused with fear. The erotic and the horrific were not two separate realms. They lived in the same bed under the same blanket of superstition and power. And this is just the dimly lit doorway we've stepped through tonight. Ahead lie darker chambers, rituals that mingled superstition with sexualized violence, punishments designed to unman or unmake, and the strange, half-believed cures that left people worse than before. You're not yet deep enough into this labyrinth to lose the way out. But the air is already colder, the stones underfoot slick with centuries of whispered cruelty. And you're going to keep walking with me because the most unsettling truths of the medieval bedroom are still waiting in the shadows ahead. The further you go, the heavier the air becomes, as if the very stones around you are steeped in centuries of guilt and whispered accusations. It's here that you begin to notice how sexual discipline in the medieval world was not simply about punishing the guilty, It was about shaping everyone's behavior through the spectacle of punishment. To be seen humiliated was to be reduced, and in an era where honor was currency, that reduction was often worse than death. Take, for instance, the custom in certain regions of forcing women accused of adultery to undergo the ordeal of the river. She would be stripped to a thin shift or sometimes entirely naked, bound loosely and pushed into the cold current before the eyes of the gathered town. If she floated, it was said the water rejected her for her impurity. If she sank well, perhaps God was merciful enough to take her quickly. The humiliation wasn't only in the act of exposure. It was in the way the crowd became complicit, their laughter and jeers wrapping around her like chains. Men, too, had their own unique humiliations. In the Low Countries and parts of Germany, a husband who failed to control his wife's fidelity could be made to ride backward on a donkey through the village wearing an elaborate mock bridle and sometimes holding a symbolic broom or distaff household tools that marked him as emasculated. The crowd's derision wasn't just aimed at him as a man. It was aimed at the notion that he'd failed to master his household, which in their eyes meant he'd failed at the sexual governance of his wife. In the realm of religious authority, the line between penance and sexualized cruelty blurred in unsettling ways. Certain monasteries, for instance, kept records of special penances for monks or nuns accused of sexual misconduct. These could involve being stripped to the waist and flogged in the chapter house before the gathered community. The blows were often delivered slowly, with prayers or psalms chanted between each strike, a rhythm that turned the act into a ritual of shame. For women, the chapter house punishment might be combined with the shearing of hair, a stripping away of beauty and identity, leaving them shorn like criminals or slaves. Then there were the private interrogations that masqueraded as spiritual guidance. Confessors, some well-meaning, some far from it, probed their penitents for intimate details of their sexual lives. These weren't always brief or perfunctory. The manuals for confessors actually encouraged detailed questioning under the idea that sin must be fully named to be forgiven. So a nervous young man or woman might be pressed to recount exactly how they touched themselves, what thoughts they had, whether they found pleasure in it, and whether they repeated the act. You can imagine the mortification, the heat in the face, the trembling voice, and in some cases, the confessor's own gaze lingering too long, his pen scratching down notes as though cataloging a specimen. Outside the cloisters, superstition about sexuality flourished in the villages and towns. Folk healers peddled remedies for wayward lust, many of them involving bizarre and invasive rituals. A man suspected of being too lustful might be told to wear a charm made from a dried animal, part the paw of a mole, the genitals of a goat, strapped directly to his body under his clothes. Women accused of being too cold or too fiery might be subjected to herbal fumigations, forced to sit skirtless over a steaming pot of herbs, the vapors rising between their thighs, in the belief that this would rebalance their sexual humors. Whether the process burned, suffocated, or simply humiliated them was of little concern to those administering it. War, too, remained a theater for sexual horror. When a castle fell or a town was sacked, sexual violence wasn't merely an opportunistic crime. It was a deliberate act of domination. The chroniclers of the 100 Years' War, for example, record instances of women paraded naked through the streets before being assaulted, the invaders laughing at their tears, as though the cruelty were a kind of performance. In some sieges, captives were forced to witness the assault of their own kin before being killed or enslaved themselves. This was meant to poison the very memory of the place, to leave behind a scar in the collective mind that could not heal. Even in peacetime, sexual coercion could be built into the fabric of authority. Certain lords claimed a droit du seigneur, the supposed right, to spend the first night with a new bride from among their vassals, while historians debate how often this was actually exercised. The fear of it was real enough to leave traces in folk songs, plays, and bitter village gossip. Whether myth or reality, the idea carried the weight of a public secret, the knowledge that power could, if it chose, take what it wanted from your marriage bed. Public spectacle also fed on sexualized cruelty in the theater of punishment. In some cities, executioners doubled as masters of humiliation. A woman convicted of prostitution might be paraded through the market with her hair shorn and her face smeared with soot, forced to ring a bell with each step. In some cases, she would be made to carry a wooden phallus in both hands, the crowd's laughter chasing her down every cobblestone. This wasn't simply to brand her a sinner. It was to break her spirit, to make her live as an object of ridicule long after the sentence ended. Men convicted of sexual crimes could meet a more brutal fate, strapped to a whipping post in the public square, trousers torn away, the lashes falling where they would cause the deepest shame. Some were fitted with iron cages or collars that forced them to keep their heads bowed, unable to meet the gaze of those who passed. Others, particularly those accused of unnatural acts, faced surgical mutilation, in full view of onlookers, a moment of horror, designed as much for the lesson it taught as for the punishment itself. And in the dark corners of domestic life, cruelty could be quieter, but no less horrific. A jealous husband might lock away his wife, deny her food, or beat her for imagined flirtations, acts justified by the belief that a man had the God-given right to govern his wife's sexuality. In some regions, women suspected of infidelity were subjected to trial by midwife, a brutal inspection for signs of pregnancy or looseness conducted by other women, but under the eyes of the husband or village elders. The invasive probing was as much about humiliation as about finding truth. It's worth remembering that medieval society saw sexuality not as a private matter, but as a thread woven into the moral fabric of the community. When that thread frayed, the whole cloth was thought to be at risk, and so the punishments were public, dramatic, and often sexual in their cruelty. This logic made it easy to cross the line from discipline into sadism. It also meant that ordinary people learned to watch each other, to police not just their neighbors' actions, but their desires, because in the medieval mind, unchecked lust could bring divine wrath on the entire village. As you walk further into this shadowed past, you start to realize that medieval sexual horror was never just about the act itself. It was about the web of power, shame, and superstition that made the act possible and, in many cases, inevitable. You can still hear the echo of the jeers in the marketplace, the low chanting in the chapter house, the whisper of skirts over the cold stone as a prisoner is led away. And ahead are the darker rites, the strange mingling of medicine and magic, the moments when cruelty masqueraded as healing, and when the line between desire and punishment all but disappeared. The deeper you descend, the stranger the air becomes, thick with the mingled scents of incense, sweat, and something metallic like old blood on iron. It is here in the dim crossroads between religion, medicine, and superstition that the medieval world devised its most intimate cruelties. You begin to see that the body in these centuries was treated as a canvas upon which morality, fear, and power were painted in strokes both subtle and savage. Among the most disturbing intersections of faith and flesh were the so-called cures for sexual sins. In monasteries and convents, penitents might be subjected to flagellation, not the quick theatrical lashings of public shame, but slow, deliberate scourging, meant to mortify the flesh and, by extension, the desires of the soul. This could go on for hours, sometimes days, in dim chambers, where the sound of leather on skin was accompanied by murmured prayers. For the victim, the pain and the shame braided together into something inescapable. A punishment, they were told, was also a mercy. The flagellation of nuns carried its own uniquely cruel edge. A sister accused of succumbing to temptation could be stripped to her shift and whipped in the refectory before the gathered convent, her vows read aloud between strikes. In some cases, the scourging was extended, each blow accompanied by the recitation of a psalm, dragging the ordeal into hours. The paradox was chilling. The act was framed as a way of saving her soul, yet it was performed in a way that laid her bare both physically and spiritually before her entire community. Outside the cloisters, healers and so-called physicians offered their own remedies for lust, many of which were as invasive as they were ineffective. For men accused of uncontrollable desire, some medical texts recommended cauterizing the loins with heated metal rods, a process justified as sealing off the seat of lust. Women might be subjected to purgatives, herbal concoctions that induced violent vomiting or diarrhea under the belief that they expelled excess heat from the body. In reality, they left the patient weak, humiliated, and often permanently damaged. Then there were the fumigations, a practice that bridged folk magic and rudimentary gynecology. A woman suspected of withholding herself from her husband, or of having been unfaithful, might be forced to sit bare over a brazier of smoldering herbs, the smoke curling upward into her most private places. Ostensibly, this was to cleanse her, but the experience was degrading and often painful. The act was carried out with women restrained or held down by others under the gaze of husbands, elders, or midwives, who acted as moral arbiters. The medieval fascination with physical signs of sin also gave rise to sin inspections, invasive searches for bodily marks, said to betray sexual misconduct. Women accused of fornication, adultery, or witchcraft might be stripped and examined for hidden moles, scars, or unusual textures in the flesh. In some cases, the examiner was a man of the law. In others, it was a midwife or healer coerced into the role. The inspection itself became a kind of public violation, especially when it was carried out in a communal space with the accused unable to cover herself as the searching hands and prying eyes lingered. There were also the chilling trial by touch ordeals. In certain cases of disputed paternity or suspected adultery, a woman might be forced to endure the hands of male elders or jurors who claimed to be testing her body for signs of recent intimacy. The pretense was that the body would somehow reveal the truth. The reality was that this was sanctioned, groping humiliation under the cloak of investigation. In the realm of criminal punishment, sexualized torture was an accepted tool for extracting confessions. Prisoners accused of sexual crimes or witchcraft, which often carried sexual allegations, might be subjected to genital-crushing devices, heated irons, or the insertion of foreign objects as part of their interrogation. These methods were defended in the language of necessity, yet they were carried out with a disturbing focus on the sexual organs, as though to break not just the body, but the sexual self. There was also the practice of public exposure, a punishment that blurred the line between justice and spectacle. In markets and town squares, offenders might be bound naked to a pillory, their crimes announced by a crier. Passers-by were encouraged to jeer, to throw filth, and in some cases to grope the exposed prisoner. Women accused of prostitution were frequent targets. So were men accused of sodomy. The ordeal could last hours, the victim shivering and degraded every second, a performance for the crowd. For all the brutality of these punishments, there was also a quieter, more insidious cruelty, the way that sexual suspicion could be weaponized in everyday disputes. A man might accuse his neighbor's wife of impropriety simply to gain leverage in a land dispute. A woman might whisper that a rival had seduced someone's husband to ruin her reputation. In a world where such accusations could lead to public shaming, invasive examination, or worse, the threat alone was often enough to destroy a life. And in the shadows of marriage itself, coercion was written into the very vows. The church taught that a wife owed her husband the marital debt, her body, whenever he demanded it, under pain of mortal sin if she refused. This doctrine gave cover to marital rape not as a crime but as a husband's right. In some regions, refusal could even be grounds for annulment, or for the husband to take a mistress openly. The idea that a woman might own her own body was alien to the medieval mind. Her sexuality was a resource to be managed by her husband, her family, and the moral authority of the church. Among the peasantry, there was a particularly cruel custom for dealing with brides suspected of not being virgins on their wedding night. In some villages, the bed linens were inspected the next morning for blood. If none was found, the bride might be paraded through the streets, jeered at, and sometimes beaten by women of the village. This wasn't merely about sexual purity. It was about property and honor, the assurance that the bride's fertility had not been spent elsewhere. The public shaming served as both punishment and warning to other young women. And hovering over all of this was the constant threat of being branded literally. In some regions, sexual offenders were marked with hot irons, the scars burned into their skin in shapes that declared their crime. A woman might carry the letter A for adultery. A man might bear a mark indicating sodomy. The branding was usually done in public, the hiss of the iron meeting flesh, a sound meant to sear itself into the memories of everyone present. You begin to understand that in the medieval world, sexuality was never simply about pleasure or intimacy. It was a realm of constant risk, where your body could be turned against you in an instant, as evidence, as a target, as the stage for punishment. The cruelty wasn't always in the intent. Sometimes it was in the cold indifference of those who believed they were saving your soul, curing your humors, or defending the honor of the community. And yet in their rituals and punishments, there is a strange echo of fascination, a morbid intimacy between the punisher and the punished. You walk on past the low-lit corridors of monasteries, past the smoky rooms of village healers, past the whipping posts in the town squares. The path ahead is darker still. Here the punishments take on the shape of performance. Cruelty becomes entertainment, and the boundary between justice and sadistic theater crumbles to dust. You're still in the labyrinth, and the worst is yet to come. The deeper you travel into this medieval labyrinth, the more you notice how cruelty and spectacle have fused into one, as if justice itself has become a form of theater. You've already seen the humiliations of the pillory, the invasive inspections, the ritualized beatings in cloisters. But here in the next chamber of history, the punishments are not just acts of discipline. They are staged performances meant to be remembered, retold, and feared long after the screams have faded. In some market towns, a person accused of sexual transgression could become the centerpiece of a festival like humiliation. Executioners who doubled as showmen might dress the accused in absurd costumes, garish masks, crude imitations of lovers' garments, exaggerated symbols of their sin made from wood or cloth. A man accused of adultery might be given a hat shaped like a pair of horns, the universal symbol of the cuckold. Women accused of promiscuity could be forced to wear a painted placard hanging from their necks, with lewd drawings paraded through the crowd to the sound of pipes and drums. The carnival atmosphere made it worse, not better. The jeers of children, the mocking songs sung by neighbors, the laughter of strangers, all pressed down like a suffocating weight. The punishment became a traveling rumor, a story to be told in taverns embroidered upon exaggerated, until it outgrew the truth entirely. Long after the public walk was over, the condemned would still feel the invisible touch of 1,000 eyes. Public beatings could also be transformed into grotesque entertainment. In some towns, a convicted offender would be tied to a cart and whipped while being dragged slowly through every street. The route was deliberate, past the homes of prominent citizens, past the church, past the market. Each lash timed to keep the crowd engaged. The executioner might pause for dramatic effect, letting the victim sag against the ropes before striking again. In this way, the suffering became a kind of slow unfolding drama, and the audience, complicit in its cruelty, felt no shame in their applause or their taunts. Some punishments were staged specifically to attack the very symbols of sexuality. In one German town's records, there's mention of the phallus parade in which men convicted of certain sexual crimes were forced to carry oversized wooden phalluses through the streets before being flogged. In another, a prostitute might be forced to wear a frame made of reeds that spread her skirts outward like a grotesque parody of courtly fashion, exposing her underclothes to the laughter of onlookers. Medieval Europe also loved its mock trials, sham proceedings, staged in public squares, where the accused was already found guilty before the first word was spoken. A popular form of this involved a trial for sexual misconduct that culminated not in a fine or imprisonment, but in an orchestrated humiliation. The judge would read a list of charges exaggerated to absurdity, while witnesses, often actors or willing townsfolk, acted out crude comic versions of the supposed offense. The crowd howled, the accused burned with shame, and the sentence was always the same: more ridicule, more exposure, more stripping away of dignity. Even church penance could be staged for public consumption. In some parishes, a sinner would be made to stand barefoot at the church door during Sunday Mass, dressed in nothing but a simple shift or shirt, holding a candle as a sign of repentance. But sometimes the priest or parishioners added flourishes, placing a rope around the neck, a bundle of birch twigs in the hands, or even leading the penitent through the churchyard, while the congregation sang mocking verses. These rituals blurred the line between spiritual correction and public shaming, to the point where it was difficult to tell which was the true goal. The medieval stage was not limited to civic or religious punishment. Traveling players and minstrels sometimes worked sexual disgrace into their performances. In their comic interludes, they might parody a real-life scandal from a nearby village, disguising names but leaving enough clues for the audience to know exactly who was being mocked. The victims could only watch their shame turned into an evening's entertainment, powerless to stop the laughter. In some cases, these performances became so elaborate that they bordered on pageantry. Chronicles describe elaborate ridings in which the offender was paraded on a cart or a donkey, surrounded by musicians, jesters, and masked townsfolk who pantomimed lewd acts. These events could draw large crowds from surrounding areas, turning private disgrace into a regional attraction. And while some participants might insist they were merely upholding moral order, the glee with which they took part told a different story. Medieval punishments could also borrow the imagery of marriage and turn it inside out. In certain villages, adulterers were married to each other in a mock ceremony, dressed in mismatched, absurd garments, crowned with flowers, wilting in the sun, forced to recite vows before the jeering crowd. Afterward, they might be led to a mock bridal bed, set up in the square where they were made to lie down together as the onlookers roared. The humiliation was doubly potent. It mocked the sanctity of marriage and cemented the offender's shame in the memory of everyone present. There was also the Charivari, a noisy, chaotic procession to shame newlyweds who married improperly, whether because of an age gap, suspected infidelity, or simply local disapproval. The crowd banged pots, blew horns, and shouted obscenities outside the couple's home sometimes for several nights in a row. In extreme cases, they would burst inside, dragging the couple into the street to be mocked, paraded, or even beaten. While technically not a legal punishment, the Charivari was often more feared than the court because it left no escape, no hiding place, and no hope of forgetting. And still, the cruelty could escalate further. In some coastal towns, sexual offenders were taken to the docks and publicly dunked in the harbor not just once, but repeatedly to the point of near drowning. This ducking was often combined with ridicule, with the crowd chanting crude rhymes timed to each immersion. For women, their skirts and hair plastered to their bodies became part of the spectacle. For men, the sodden shame was compounded by the sputtering gasps for breath. All of this worked because it was memorable. Medieval punishments were not just about the moment of suffering. They were about planting an image in the minds of everyone who witnessed it. That image would live on in tavern tales and gossip, in the whispered warnings of parents to children. Don't be like them. And so the humiliation became a kind of public property owned and repeated by the community long after the formal sentence was over. You can see as you move further into this world that the line between punishment and pleasure for the audience was paper thin. The crowd might pretend they were there to uphold virtue, but their laughter, their eagerness to participate told another story, one in which the suffering of another human being was as much a form of entertainment as a morality lesson. Ahead, the path narrows again. The next chamber is darker still, for here, the punishments no longer just humiliate, they wound. They maim, they leave bodies and souls permanently altered. And in the shadow of these acts, you will see the truest face of medieval sexual cruelty, the one that no amount of pious justification can disguise. The passage ahead feels narrower, the stones colder underfoot. The air smells faintly of scorched flesh, and you realize you're moving into a place where humiliation was no longer enough, where the punishments turned to disfigurement, to making the body itself a lifelong warning. This is where medieval justice showed its sharpest edge, where the goal was not just to shame, but to break. In some cities, castration was the prescribed penalty for certain sexual crimes. It was carried out publicly, the offender bound, sometimes gagged, to muffle the inevitable screams. The procedure could be crude and agonizing, done with heated blades to cauterize the wound, or cold steel to let the bleeding serve as a further deterrent. There are accounts of victims being displayed afterward, pale and trembling, so that the crowd could see the consequences in the flesh. To the medieval mind, this was a clean solution. It prevented further offenses and sent a shudder through anyone who might have harbored similar desires. Mutilation was not confined to men. Women accused of adultery in certain parts of Europe faced the slitting of their noses, a mark that could never be hidden, ensuring their shame followed them everywhere. This was a punishment favored in situations where a husband or male relative wanted to make sure a woman could never remarry, never reclaim her place in respectable society. Sometimes ears were cropped, cheeks branded, or lips split as part of the sentence, leaving a face permanently altered to tell a story of disgrace. Branding, too, could be escalated into something more than a letter on the skin. In some towns, irons were shaped into grotesque symbols, a lewd caricature of the offense, and pressed into the thigh, the belly, or even the breast. These scars became both stigma and spectacle, a cruel kind of biography written in flesh. And if the victim dared to leave their hometown to escape the whispers, the mark ensured that the story would follow them into every new market square and parish church. In other cases, the body itself was turned into a site of prolonged torture. Some offenders were placed in iron cages designed to expose their most intimate parts to the elements. They would be left for hours or days, enduring sunburn, insect bites, and the stares of passers-by who could not resist a lingering glance. The cages were often positioned in high-traffic areas by the gates of the town near the church doors, so that every entry and exit became a reminder of the fate awaiting those who strayed. There were also cruel devices specifically designed to attack the sexual organs. One infamous example was the pear of anguish, a metal implement, inserted into the mouth rectum, or vagina, then expanded with a screw mechanism until the internal tissue tore. The supposed justification was to punish liars, sodomites, or women accused of promiscuity, but the device's design betrayed a fascination with the act of penetration turned inside out. Surviving one of these ordeals meant living with internal injuries, chronic pain, and the certainty that the body would never function as it once had. Some punishments took the form of forced medical procedures. In certain cases, accused prostitutes were subjected to crude surgical cauterization, where heated metal was applied to the genital area in the belief that it would cure their lust. The burns left scars that could make normal sexual function impossible, a brutal enforcement of chastity through physical ruin. These acts were performed not in secret, but under official sanction, sometimes even in the open air, with the same theatricality as a hanging or a flogging. Execution could also take on a sexualized aspect. In the most extreme cases, usually involving accusations of rape, sodomy, or sexual violence during wartime death, was delivered with calculated mutilation. A condemned man might be hanged by the genitals before being strangled, or his body burned after public castration. A woman might be stripped, whipped, and stoned in a public square before being executed. The intention was clear to bind the sexual crime and the execution into a single, unforgettable act. Yet even in punishments that did not involve mutilation, there were ways of inflicting lingering physical harm. The stocks and pillories, for instance, could be modified so that the victim's legs or arms were spread painfully wide, making them unable to shield themselves from prying eyes. Hours spent in such positions could leave muscles and joints permanently damaged, a reminder in every stiff step of the day they were put on display. In rural communities where formal executioners were rare punishments, could take on a more improvisational cruelty. A man accused of impregnating a woman out of wedlock might be seized by her relatives and subjected to what they called a rough justice, dragged behind a cart, beaten, and in some cases gelded with farm tools. The brutality was intimate, carried out within the closed circle of a family or village, but it was no less devastating for being unofficial. Women could face their own forms of village-level mutilation. One recorded custom in certain alpine valleys involved shaming a suspected adulteress by cutting off her hair and rubbing her scalp with pitch, leaving her both bald and painfully blistered. The pitch clung for days, drawing flies and dirt, and the stench marked her as surely as any iron brand. This was often followed by banishment, ensuring that her disgrace was carried with her into every new settlement she approached. And hovering behind many of these acts was the belief that physical harm could cleanse the soul. The same logic that sanctioned flogging in monasteries also justified the searing of flesh, the cutting of skin, the breaking of bones. The pain was framed as redemptive, the scar as a kind of spiritual seal. In this way, mutilation could be passed off as both punishment and cure, a grotesque mercy offered to the sinner. What is most unsettling is how often the community became part of the violence. Neighbors watched, jeered, even helped restrain the condemned. Children were brought to witness so they might learn. Women whispered about the victim's past, as though the mutilation were the natural conclusion to their story. The act became a shared ritual, binding the community together in the belief that justice had been done, even as it left another human being forever broken. You can feel it now, the labyrinth walls closing and the darkness growing denser. These were not the random cruelties of a few deranged individuals. They were sanctioned, codified, woven into the law and the rhythm of village life. Each punishment was both a warning and a performance, and the body was the stage. The path ahead will not lead you out yet. Beyond this chamber lie the strange mingled worlds of superstition and medicine, where the supposed healers of the body used their knowledge in ways that could be as invasive, as violating as any executioner's blade. You'll see cures for lust that chilled the flesh, remedies for infertility that cut deeper than disease, and rituals that blurred the line between treatment and torment. And as you move toward that place, the smell of burning herbs mixes with the scent of iron, and you realize here in the medieval world, there was never truly a difference between the knife and the cure. The corridor you follow now is lined not with chains or iron cages, but with shelves of dusty jars and bundles of dried herbs. Yet the air is no kinder here. It smells of burnt sage, bitter roots, and old sweat. You have stepped into the chamber of the medieval healer, a place where the line between medicine and punishment dissolves entirely, where cures could humiliate, injure, or even kill in the name of restoring moral and physical order. Medieval medicine was built on the theory of humors, the belief that health depended on the balance of blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sexuality was thought to be deeply connected to these humors, with lust seen as a symptom of excess heat or moisture in the body. The remedies designed to correct these imbalances could be invasive, degrading, and often far more dangerous than the supposed illness. One common treatment for uncontrolled desire in men was bloodletting from the groin. The patient would be restrained, trousers removed, and the physician, often assisted by a barber surgeon, would make incisions near the femoral vein. The blood would be allowed to flow until weakness and dizziness set in, under the assumption that lust drained with it. The location of the cuts, so close to the genitals, ensured that the procedure was both physically dangerous and deeply humiliating. For women deemed overheated by passion, physicians prescribed purging and cooling therapies. One involved placing cold, damp cloths over the lower abdomen and inner thighs for hours, sometimes packed with snow or ice in winter months. The chill was meant to quench the fire of desire, but it could induce shock, frostbite, or illness. The patient's shivering body became a visible sign of her supposed moral correction, her teeth chattering as the healer nodded in satisfaction. Another treatment borrowed from ancient gynecological practice was forced fumigation. The woman would be made to sit naked or skirtless over a vessel of smoldering herbs, rosemary, pennyroyal, or rue the vapors rising between her legs. In theory, this was to cleanse the womb or restore fertility. In practice, it was invasive, painful, and often performed in the presence of others who assisted by holding her in place. In some cases, the herbs were replaced with more acrid substances like sulfur or vinegar, intensifying the burning sensation and leaving the tissues raw. The medieval healer's bag of remedies also included ointments and poultices applied directly to the genitals. For men accused of lechery, these might contain strong irritants like mustard seed garlic or quicklime rubbed into the skin until it blistered. The belief was that by making the organ painful to use, the urge would be quelled. The victim was left to writhe in a mixture of shame and agony, the remedy a punishment in all but name. Women suspected of infidelity or promiscuity might be given pessaries, small devices or plugs inserted into the vagina coated with herbs or resins meant to cool or dry the womb. Some of these substances were mildly toxic. Others were corrosive, causing burns and ulcerations. Removal could be difficult or impossible without further injury, and in certain cases the pessary was intentionally left in place for days as a form of chastisement disguised as medicine. Then there were the restorative tonics brews designed to address infertility or frigidity. These could contain animal organs, ground bone, or even powdered human remains stirred into wine or ale. Women were urged to drink them under the watch of family or midwives, the taste foul enough to gag. The act itself became a ritual of submission, a swallowing of both the draught and the unspoken shame that came with admitting one's body had failed in its reproductive duty. The blending of medicine and superstition could take on an even more disturbing form in cases of suspected impotence or sterility. A man might be ordered to submit to trial Congress a forced public attempt at intercourse with his wife, overseen by physicians, clergy, or legal witnesses. The couple would be placed in a guarded chamber, told to demonstrate their ability to consummate the marriage. Even if the act occurred behind a screen, the knowledge that others listened, judged, and recorded the outcome turned the bed into a stage of humiliation. Failure meant annulment, loss of property, and public disgrace. For women accused of causing a husband's impotence through sorcery, the ordeal could be reversed. She might be stripped and searched for talismans or charms, her body probed for witches' marks. In some cases, a midwife or healer was tasked with this search. In others, it was the work of men in authority who took their time under the guise of investigation. The humiliation was as much the point as the supposed discovery of evidence. Even childbirth, the one sexual consequence fully sanctioned by church and community, could become an arena for cruelty when the mother's morality was in question. An unwed mother might be denied the privacy of the birthing chamber, forced to labor in the presence of elders who berated her between contractions. Some were refused skilled assistance, given only the barest help, so that the ordeal itself would serve as penance. The infant, if it survived, could be taken away as a further punishment, its removal framed as the moral choice. Healers could also act as enforcers of chastity. In certain towns, midwives were required by law to report any unmarried woman they found to be pregnant. This turned the healer's visit into a moment of dread, a knock at the door that might lead not to help, but to public disgrace and punishment. In this way, medicine became another arm of surveillance, a quiet but pervasive threat to anyone who stepped outside accepted norms. And in all of this, you can hear the same refrain: the body was never truly one's own. Whether in the hands of the executioner or the healer, it was a site to be examined, altered, punished, and displayed. The supposed goal was moral and physical health, but the methods betrayed a fascination with control, with the spectacle of vulnerability. Pain was not a byproduct, it was a tool. Shame was not accidental, it was built into the cure. Even the architecture of healing reflected this. In some infirmaries, patients were arranged in open wards with no curtains, every treatment a public event. A man receiving a cauterization to the groin might do so within sight of women being fumigated, each made witness to the other's suffering. The mingling of bodies, cries, and smells created a theater of medicine in which privacy was impossible and dignity a luxury no one expected. As you leave this chamber, you can still hear the coughs of patience, the hiss of heated irons, the mutter of prayers over a steaming brazier. The path ahead is not lighter. In fact, it leads toward a place where superstition grows wild and tangled, where folk rituals and magical protections against lust become rituals in themselves, and where these rites can spiral into acts as cruel and invasive as any court-ordered punishment. Because here in the medieval world, even magic could be used to wound, and the hand that cast the spell could be as merciless as the one that swung the whip. The path winds downward again, and now the air smells of damp earth and smoke. You've stepped into a place where the learned language of humors and anatomy gives way to the muttered charms of village midwives, the whispered curses of hedge witches, and the rough remedies of farmers who learned their craft from generations of rumor. Here, magic and medicine blur so completely that you cannot tell one from the other, except that both could be turned toward cruelty as easily as toward healing. In the medieval village, sexuality was bound tightly to superstition. Lust could be inflamed by a curse, cooled by a charm, or bound by a ritual. And just as charms could be sought willingly, they could also be forced upon you as a warning, a punishment, or a means of control. A man accused of chasing too many women might wake to find a binding knot placed under his pillow, a twisted cord of hair, and nettles tied with a curse to rob him of his virility. In some villages, these bindings were not subtle. They were nailed to the door of the offender's home, a public proclamation that his desire had been magically stopped. Women accused of promiscuity could be subjected to cooling charms. One common rite involved leading the woman to a crossroads at night, forcing her to stand barefoot in a circle drawn in salt, while the village's cunning woman muttered incantations. The wind was believed to carry away her lust, but the scene was staged so that neighbors could watch from the shadows, turning the ritual into a spectacle of shame. There were also harsher magical rites, particularly in cases where someone's sexuality was seen as threatening the community's moral balance. A suspected adulterer might be made to drink a potion brewed from bitter herbs, ashes, and their own hair, a concoction said to break desire. The act of preparing and drinking it was deliberately humiliating, the victim forced to acknowledge in front of witnesses that their lust was so dangerous it needed magical intervention. The belief in magical causes for impotence or infertility gave rise to invasive cures. A man suspected of being cursed might be told to bathe in a stream at dawn naked, while the village's healer recited prayers and splashed him with water. Often the healer insisted the ritual required witnesses to ensure it was done properly, which meant neighbors or even family would be present. The shame was as much a part of the cure as the cold water. Women suspected of bewitching a man's desire could face the dreaded ordeal of baking. She would be forced to knead dough in front of the community, bare-armed, sometimes bare-shouldered, and watched for signs of witchcraft in the way she handled the bread. In certain areas, the bread was then fed to the supposed victim, a symbolic act meant to reverse the spell. The woman's body became part of the public drama, her movements scrutinized for any hint of guilt. Sexual jealousy could spark its own kind of folk punishment. In some regions, it was believed that a woman who seduced another's husband could have her beauty taken through a ritual shaving of the head and eyebrows. This wasn't done in private. The accused would be seized, her hair hacked away while a crowd shouted insults, sometimes spitting on her or smearing her with ash. She would then be led through the village so that everyone could see the result, a magical unmaking of her allure that was also a very real act of humiliation. For men, an equivalent existed in the form of the mock gelding. While actual castration was rare outside of formal punishment, the threat of it was acted out in theatrical village rituals. A man accused of unwanted advances might be dragged to a barn, stripped from the waist down, and made to endure the cold press of shears or knives against his thighs while the crowd laughed. Sometimes they went further, daubing him with pig's blood or tying a wooden phallus to his back as he was run out of town. Superstition also worked its way into marriage customs, sometimes in ways that blurred consent. In certain areas, it was believed that to ensure fertility, a bride had to be symbolically loosened before her wedding night. This could involve a ritual spanking or a brief exposure to male hands, often those of the groom's friends, in a mock blessing. Though framed as playful, the act was a public touching of the bride's body sanctioned by custom, and often leaving her red-faced and humiliated. In reverse, there were fertility rites meant to shame couples who had been married for years without conceiving. They might be forced to lie together in a field under the moon while neighbors circled them chanting and throwing seeds. This was supposed to invite fertility, but it was also a public display of their intimate failure. The couple's private sorrow became a form of village entertainment, dressed up in the language of magical aid. Accusations of sexual magic could justify even more invasive rituals. In some places, a woman believed to have bewitched a man's desire could be searched for concealed charms. This might mean a midwife examining her body, but it could just as easily be the rough hands of a constable or village elder pulling at her clothing, patting her down in front of witnesses. The search itself was considered proof. If she resisted, she must be hiding something. The cruelty of these acts was amplified by their theatricality. Magic in the medieval world was not quiet. It was a performance. Charms were burned in public hearths, cursed objects nailed to doors, potions poured out in the square. And if the accused had to participate in the undoing of their own spell, so much the better. It was a way to turn suspicion into humiliation, and humiliation into a shared story that everyone in the village could tell. Even protective magic could become a tool of control. A husband might insist that his wife wear an amulet to guard her virtue. A trinket hung low on a chain so that it rested against her skin under her shift. In theory, it was for her own good. In practice, it was a reminder every time she dressed or undressed that her fidelity was under magical surveillance. You see now that superstition, far from being a harmless curiosity, could be as sharp as any blade. It gave license to touch, to strip, to mark, to parade. It wrapped cruelty in the soft cloth of tradition and convinced entire communities that they were protecting themselves while they were in truth indulging in a darker pleasure, the public stripping away of someone's dignity. Ahead, the way curves once more into shadow. You are moving toward a place where superstition is no longer confined to the village green, where it merges with the machinery of formal justice. Here, accusations of magical interference in sexuality can lead to trials, torture, and death, and the performances of the past will seem almost gentle compared to what waits in that next chamber. The path tightens again, the walls pressing close. Ahead, you can hear the murmur of voices, low, official, but tinged with anticipation. You've left the open-air cruelty of the village behind and entered the colder, more deliberate arena of formal accusation. Here, superstition doesn't merely whisper over the hedge or around the hearth. It is written into law, codified into procedures, and enforced by men whose robes and seals give weight to every suspicion. And in this place, when sexual impropriety and magic are named in the same breath, the result can be fatal. The medieval mind believed that the devil's power most often entered the world through the flesh. Lust was his favorite tool, and witches, it was said, were his agents spreading desire where it did not belong, stealing potency from men, withering the wombs of women. A simple accusation that someone had bewitched another's sexuality could be enough to bring them before a tribunal. And once you were standing there, accused, the machinery of humiliation and violence began to turn. The proceedings started with interrogation, but this was not the polite questioning of modern courts. The accused might be stripped and examined for witches' marks, strange moles, scars, or discoloration that were said to be proof of a pact with the devil. For women, this examination often focused on the breasts and genitals, as it was believed that witches suckled their demonic familiars from hidden teats. The search was invasive, and public, carried out by appointed matrons, or in some cases by men who claimed the right to inspect under the guise of justice. If the accusation involved a sexual crime, say bewitching a man into lust or impotence, the search could take on a more targeted cruelty. The woman might be probed for concealed charms, her pubic hair shorn away in front of witnesses, her body smeared with ashes or holy water to expose the supposed signs. The very act of proving innocence was indistinguishable from a ritualized assault. Men accused of using sorcery for seduction or violation faced their own humiliations. Their bodies might be searched for talismans hidden in clothing or bound to the flesh, particularly around the groin. In some recorded cases, the accused were made to stand naked while the court clerk cataloged every mark, scar, or blemish. The pretense was thoroughness. The reality was degradation. When questioning alone failed to produce a confession, the law had other tools, and torture, justified as a means to save the accused's soul through repentance, was considered entirely legitimate. For women accused of sexual sorcery, torture often targeted the parts of the body tied to the alleged crime. A notorious example was the use of the leg screw or Spanish boot-heavy boards clamped around the calves, tightened with wedges until bone splintered. The victim might be stripped to the shift, her legs bared to the assembled officials, the pain meant to force her to name accomplices or admit to imagined liaisons with the devil. Men accused of such crimes could be subjected to genital-crushing devices, iron clamps tightened slowly until the soft tissue ruptured. The justification was grimly practical. If the accused had used his body as an instrument of sorcery, then breaking that body was a way to end the magic. Even when death was not the immediate result, permanent injury was almost guaranteed. Inquisitorial manuals encouraged a particular rhythm to these tortures, a cycle of pain, pause, and questioning, designed to wear down the mind as well as the body. Between sessions, the accused might be paraded in partial clothing through the streets, a reminder to the public of both the danger they represented and the justice being done. For women, the display could include forced wearing of symbols, a wooden phallus hung from the neck, to mark her as a corrupter of men, or a crown of thorns to signify false purity. Trials themselves could be public theater. Witnesses came forward with stories of overheard whispers, glimpsed encounters, changes in a neighbor's behavior. A man's sudden impotence was enough to send murmurs through the crowd. A woman's unexpected pregnancy could be twisted into evidence of supernatural seduction. The accused might be forced to sit in the center of the court, wearing a penitential gown, listening as their most private moments, real or imagined, were dissected in front of neighbors, family, and strangers alike. Some cases ended in acquittal, but many did not. For those found guilty, the sentence could range from perpetual banishment to death, with every option laced in public shame. Women might be whipped through the town, their hair cut away, their bodies branded before being exiled. Men might be mutilated their ears or nose taken, or in the gravest cases castrated before being hanged. The crowd gathered not just to witness, but to remember, to pass the story along as a warning and perhaps as a guilty pleasure. The execution of a witch accused of sexual sorcery was a performance in itself. Burning was the most notorious punishment, though it was not always carried out to the letter. In some places, the condemned were first strangled before the fire was lit. In others, they were burned alive, the flames licking at bare skin, while the crowd prayed aloud for their soul's salvation. Women were often bound in their shifts, which clung and smoldered against the body, a slow revelation of flesh in the midst of agony. The spectacle was a contradiction, a public moral cleansing enacted through the display of the very body it sought to condemn. Men accused of sexual witchcraft could be hanged, drowned, or burned, but some faced additional degradation. In certain records, their genitals were cut away before execution displayed to the crowd as a symbol of their crime. The mingling of mutilation and death ensured that the punishment was both a legal sentence and a lasting image, one that the community would carry in its collective memory. Even in cases where execution was avoided, the stain of the accusation lingered. An acquitted man might find his marriage prospects destroyed. An acquitted woman could become a permanent outcast, treated as dangerous company for wives and daughters. The public nature of the trial ensured that there was no return to anonymity. The process itself was the punishment, with the formal verdict almost irrelevant, and so the fusion of superstition and formal justice became a machine that could strip away not only life, but dignity. The courts claimed they were defending the community's moral order, but the rituals of accusation, search, torture, and sentencing were steeped in the same fascination with sexual shame you have seen in every other chamber of this labyrinth. They did not simply punish the crime. They staged it, replayed it, and inscribed it on the body for all to see. You realize now that you are moving toward the deepest heart of this world, a place where the punishments are no longer confined to those caught breaking the rules, but extend to those simply caught in the wrong place under the wrong gaze at the wrong time. Here, sexuality itself is a trap, a net flung wide enough to catch anyone regardless of guilt. And once you are tangled in it, the path leads only further into the darkness. The air grows colder here, as though you've stepped into a vault where centuries of breathless whispers have been sealed away. You've left behind the structured cruelty of trials and entered the more unpredictable realm of suspicion, a place where a stray glance, an ill-timed word, or even a dream recounted by a neighbor could brand you as dangerous. In this shadowed corridor, you see that the medieval world didn't need proof of wrongdoing to ruin a person. It only needed the right story told in the right ear. Sexual suspicion was a powerful weapon, and it could be turned against anyone. A widow who lived alone might be said to lure young men into her cottage. A traveling merchant who stayed too long in a village might be accused of tempting wives while their husbands were away. Even a midwife respected for her skill could be whispered about if too many of her clients bore children out of wedlock. The line between ordinary life and scandal was thin, and it shifted with the moods of those who watched you. For women, danger often came disguised as neighborly curiosity. A married woman seen speaking privately with a man who was not her husband might find herself watched, her movements noted. If her demeanor seemed too cheerful, her dress too fine, her hair too well kept. The murmurs began, she must have a lover. Those murmurs could harden into an accusation, and once spoken aloud, the burden was hers to prove her innocence, a task made nearly impossible in a world that trusted gossip over denial. Men were not immune. A young man seen spending too much time with children could be accused of corrupting them. A bachelor who kept to himself might be suspected of unnatural practices. And any man whose wife left him for any reason risked being branded as impotent or worse, as a man who sought satisfaction outside the bounds of approved relationships. Once the rumor took hold, every gesture, every friendship, every solitary walk became suspect. The church's confessional booth became both a sanctuary and a snare. Parishioners were encouraged to confess even the smallest of impure thoughts, and priests were trained to probe for details. A moment of candor, an admission of desire, a half-remembered dream could be twisted into evidence that you were sliding toward sin. And in a world where the priest's word carried weight in both heaven and earth, such a suggestion could follow you into the marketplace, into your home, into your very bed. Sometimes, suspicion was born from nothing more than misinterpreted piety. A widow who devoted herself to the church might be accused of seeking carnal visions under the guise of religious fervor. A man who avoided marriage might be said to have married himself to vice. Devotion could be reinterpreted as perversion with a single sly remark. And once such an interpretation caught fire, there was no way to smother it entirely. The punishments for mere suspicion were often unofficial, but no less damaging than formal justice. You might wake to find your door smeared with dung, a sign to the village that you were impure. A crude drawing might appear on the wall of your home showing you engaged in an act you never committed. Neighbors might stop speaking to you, refusing to trade goods or share labor, turning every day into a quiet siege. More theatrical forms of shaming were also common. In some villages, suspected adulterers or fornicators were subjected to rough music, a nighttime procession of neighbors clanging pots, blowing horns, and shouting insults outside the accused's home. The noise could last for hours, preventing sleep, fraying the nerves, making the accused a spectacle in their own doorway. If they emerged to protest, they might be pelted with refuse or dragged into the street to face the jeering crowd. For women, public shaming often had a sexual edge. A suspected seductress might be forced to wear a garland of nettles around her neck, the stinging leaves brushing her skin with every movement. In some regions, she might be made to carry a spinning distaff, or a wooden doll, symbols of domestic virtue twisted into marks of disgrace. The act was meant to mock her supposed moral failings, while reminding her and everyone else of the role she was expected to play. Men accused of unmanly behavior might face equally symbolic punishments. They could be forced to wear their shirts backward to ride a donkey through the streets, holding a broom or spindle to sing bawdy songs in a falsetto voice. These rituals of reversal were meant to mark them as having stepped outside their proper sexual role, turning masculinity itself into a public performance of shame. The cruelty of suspicion was that it required no trial, no proof, no verdict. It lived in the space between what was said and what was believed. And because the medieval community was tightly woven, you could not escape it simply by keeping to yourself. Every absence from church, every late return from the fields, every small kindness shown to the wrong person could be woven into the tapestry of your supposed guilt. Some tried to fight back by making public displays of virtue, attending extra masses, giving alms in full view of neighbors, speaking loudly of their devotion to spouse and God. But such efforts could backfire. Too much piety might be read as overcompensation. Too much charity could be taken as buying forgiveness in advance. In the logic of suspicion, every move was suspect. And for those without the protection of family or wealth, suspicion could tip into physical danger. A lone woman accused of seducing married men might find her house stoned by a mob. A man whispered about as a corrupter of boys could be ambushed on a dark road, beaten and left as a warning. In such cases, the violence was rarely punished, after all the victim was already marked in the minds of their neighbors as someone who had brought trouble upon themselves. The truth was that suspicion worked because it was cheap, satisfying, and safe for those who wielded it. It cost nothing to whisper nothing, to hint nothing, to smirk knowingly when someone's name came up. And it brought a certain pleasure, the pleasure of feeling righteous, while watching another squirm, the thrill of seeing the mighty, humbled the strange delight in dressing cruelty in the clothes of moral concern. Here, in this narrowest part of the labyrinth, you can feel how suffocating it must have been to live under such a constant threat. Every smile was weighed, every gesture recorded, every friendship measured for impropriety. And in a world where privacy was almost non-existent, there was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to start fresh, nowhere to lay down the burden of other people's eyes. But the path is not finished. Ahead, you can hear a different sound, not the mutter of gossip, not the roar of a mob, but the chant of voices in unison. It is the sound of the ritual, the communal act, the moment when suspicion and punishment blend into a single shared performance. In that chamber, cruelty is no longer improvised. It is choreographed, rehearsed by centuries of repetition. And when you step into it, you will see that some of the most horrific sexual practices of the medieval world were not random acts at all. They were traditions. The sound grows clearer as you approach a rhythmic chant, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clang of metal on metal. You have reached the place where suspicion no longer whispers and punishment no longer improvises. Here the cruelty is structured, traditional, handed down like a family heirloom. It is the theater of sexual shame made into custom, a ritual performance in which everyone knows their role. These rituals could take many forms, but their aim was always the same: to mark the accused in the eyes of the entire community, to bind their guilt into memory, and to remind everyone else that the same fate could be theirs. In some towns, the charivari, the noisy mocking procession, was an annual fixture, its form so well known that a child could name each stage. But when the charivari was aimed at a sexual offense, its bite was sharper, its choreography more intimate. A man suspected of cuckolding another might be dragged from his home at night, barefoot and half-dressed, and set astride a donkey, facing backward. His head would be adorned with a set of horns, real antlers, if they could be found, wooden ones, if not. The horns announced him as the fool who had trespassed into another man's marriage. Around him, the procession surged, banging pots, blowing horns, singing bawdy songs that named his supposed lovers and mocked his prowess. For women, the ritual could be even more invasive. A suspected adulteress might be stripped to her shift and placed in a cart decorated with crude symbols, a broom tied upright, a loaf of bread hung from a cord. All of them twisted references to the domestic role she was said to have betrayed. She would be driven slowly through the village while the crowd sang songs of false love and faithless wives, each verse accompanied by mocking gestures. Some rituals focused not on adultery, but on perceived sexual mismatches in marriage. A young woman who married an older man, or a man who married a much younger woman, might find themselves the targets of a staged wedding reenactment. Villagers would dress a man and woman in rags, paint their faces white, and led them through the streets, pretending to bless their union with exaggerated, obscene gestures. The laughter was cruel because it was knowing everyone recognized the couple being mocked. There was also the ritual of skimmington, riding a punishment for men accused of being dominated by their wives or failing to control their household's virtue. The offender, real or symbolic, would be paraded on a donkey or a cart carrying a distaff or a ladle as symbols of womanly labor. Sometimes a man's wife or a willing stand-in would ride beside him, berating him loudly, while the crowd jeered. The sexual element was implicit, but powerful. The man was mocked, not just for failing as a husband, but for failing as a man. In some parts of France and Italy, a ritual known as the public bedding was twisted into a form of shaming. Normally a joyful celebration for newlyweds, the public bedding involved friends and neighbors accompanying the couple to their marital chamber, sometimes helping them undress and put them into bed. But when aimed at a couple suspected of impropriety, such as marrying after a child was conceived, the event could turn hostile. Guests would shout lewd jokes, strip the couple more roughly than necessary, and sometimes force them to kiss or embrace under the watchful eyes of the crowd. The boundary between jest and violation was paper-thin. There were rituals tied to fertility as well, often used to shame couples who failed to produce children. These could involve mock planting ceremonies, with the couple led to a field and made to dig furrows while the crowd sang fertility songs. In some villages, the man might be forced to carry a sack of grain tied conspicuously to his groin, the weight dragging at him as he stumbled along. The implication was clear: his seed was too heavy to plant or too barren to grow. Punishments could also be woven into religious festivals. On certain feast days, those accused of sexual misconduct might be made to perform exaggerated acts of penance before the congregation, crawling on hands and knees to the altar, wearing wreaths of thorns, or kissing the church threshold, while the choir sang hymns of redemption. These acts might have been presented as purely spiritual, but the sexual nature of the alleged sins gave them an undercurrent of voyeurism, especially when the accused was young or attractive. Mock trials were another favored form of ritualized humiliation. The accused would be brought before a panel of judges, sometimes real officials, sometimes chosen from among the townsfolk, who would question them with exaggerated seriousness. Witnesses would give absurdly detailed testimony, reenacting the supposed offense in comic pantomime. The trial would end in a preordained sentence, usually involving some form of public display or symbolic punishment. The laughter it provoked was part of the punishment, reducing the accused's dignity to a punchline. One of the most chilling aspects of these rituals was that they were participatory. Everyone had a part to play: the mock judges, the musicians, the jeering crowd, the people who carried the props and costumes. It was a collective act of shaming, one that bound the community together through the shared experience of punishing someone's sexuality. Refusing to take part was suspicious. It might even invite whispers that you sympathized with the offender. Even children were brought into these spectacles. Boys might run alongside the cart shouting insults, while girls carried symbolic objects: a loaf of bread, a spindle, a horn, to mark the nature of the offense. This early initiation ensured that the rituals would be remembered and repeated, passed down to the next generation, with all their cruelty intact. The accused, meanwhile, was trapped in a double bind. Resisting the ritual could lead to physical force, even greater violence, and accusations of arrogance or guilt. Enduring it in silence meant accepting the stain it left behind. Either way, the event would follow them for years, in whispered jokes, in sidelong glances, in the way people turned away when they passed. You begin to see how these rituals, though dressed in the garb of tradition, were as deliberate and as damaging as any formal punishment. They were designed to wound the soul more than the body, to strip away not just dignity, but belonging. For in the medieval world, exile from the respect of your neighbors was a kind of living death. And here's the cruelest truth: many of these customs survived for centuries, well into times we think of as modern. They were too entertaining, too cathartic for communities to abandon easily. The mixing of laughter with shame, of spectacle with judgment, was a heady brew that satisfied both moral fervor and the darker human appetite for watching someone brought low. The chant you heard at the beginning of this chamber begins to fade now, replaced by a deeper, slower rhythm, the toll of a heavy bell. Ahead lies the most solemn and final of medieval stages, the place where sexual shame and punishment meet the rituals of death. It is there that the body stripped of its future becomes the last spectacle, and the community gathers to watch not just disgrace but destruction. The bell's toll deepens as you move forward, each strike rolling through the air like a slow wave. This is no longer the brassy chaos of charivari or the mocking cries of a street procession. This is the measured sound of finality, the call that draws the whole community to witness an ending. And in the medieval world, when that ending was tied to accusations of sexual crime, it was never just about death. It was about the staging of death as a last lesson, a final performance in the long theater of shame. Executions for sexual offenses were not common enough to be everyday spectacles, but when they occurred, they were remembered for decades. The most severe sentences, death for rape, sodomy, incest, or sexual sorcery, were reserved for the cases seen as threats to the moral and spiritual health of the community. And once guilt was declared, the manner of dying was chosen as much for its symbolism as for its ability to kill. Hanging was the most common method, but for sexual crimes it often came with humiliating embellishments. A man convicted of rape might be hanged naked or stripped to his shift, so that the crowd could see his shame in both the physical and moral sense. In some cases, his genitals were bound in a visible rope, a crude signal of what had brought him to this fate. The cart that carried him to the gallows would travel slowly, allowing every villager to come out and watch. For women, hanging was often preceded by public whipping or branding. The marks would not last long on the dead flesh, but they served their purpose in the hours before execution. A convicted adulteress, especially one whose affair had led to her husband's disgrace or death, might be led through the streets, barefoot, hair shorn, her face blackened with soot, before the rope was placed around her neck. She was made a warning even before she was made a corpse. Burning at the stake was reserved for the crimes seen as most spiritually dangerous: sodomy, bestiality, sexual witchcraft, and in certain interpretations, heresy that involved sexual blasphemy. This method had its own choreography. The condemned would be bound to a post, often in their undergarments, so that the watching crowd could see both the human form and the frailty of flesh about to be consumed. Kindling was piled high, sometimes mixed with resin or pitch to ensure a slow burn. In some cases, the executioner tied small packets of gunpowder near the body to create bursts of sound and flame, turning the execution into a kind of grim pyrotechnic display. In the rare but recorded instances of castration before execution, the act was carried out in public. The removal of the offending body part was treated as a purgation, a way of symbolically cleansing the crime before the ultimate sentence. The victim's cries, the sudden rush of blood, the executioner's grim efficiency, all were meant to sear the lesson into the minds of those watching. Even after the condemned was dead, the removed parts might be displayed, hung from the gallows, or nailed to the town gate. The punishment for certain crimes could be a combination of death and mutilation. In parts of Germany, a man convicted of seducing a minor might be broken on the wheel, his limbs shattered with an iron bar before his body was left to die in the open air. If the crime was judged particularly heinous, The wheel was set upright in a public place so the body could be seen for days, crows gathering to peck at the eyes. The mingling of sexual disgrace with the slow decay of the body turned the punishment into an ongoing, open-air warning. For women, sexual crimes tied to witchcraft could lead to strangulation, before burning a gesture presented as mercy, but still deeply bound to the spectacle. The executioner would loop the cord around her neck, pull it tight until she sagged, and then step away so that the fire could finish what had been started. The crowd could thus see her body remain upright as the flames climbed her face half hidden in the smoke, a symbol of both human weakness and the community's supposed righteousness. Drowning was another method often tied to accusations of infanticide by unwed mothers. The woman would be bound and placed in a sack, sometimes with stones, and cast into a river or lake. But even here, ritual invaded necessity. In some towns, the procession to the water was a public event. The accused paraded through the streets, the sack carried in a cart, while a crier proclaimed her crime. People gathered on the banks to watch the bundle sink, to see the last bubbles break the surface, to murmur prayers for her soul, even as they took in the grim entertainment. Sexual offenses committed during war could be punished with battlefield executions, swift, but still staged for maximum effect. Captured soldiers accused of rape might be stripped, beaten, and executed in front of their comrades. The intent was not only to punish the offender, but to remind the rest that lust could be as dangerous as the enemy's sword. In some chronicled cases, the dead were left unburied, their naked bodies sprawled on the ground as a rotting emblem of dishonor. Even when the sentence was death, the medieval mind sought to ensure that the shame would outlast the flesh. Corpses could be denied burial in consecrated ground, left instead at crossroads, or hung from gallows until the bones fell apart. The implication was clear: the body that had sinned so grievously would not rest in the earth of the faithful. Family members might be forbidden to collect the remains, leaving them to the mercy of weather and scavengers. This denial of burial was as much a punishment for the living as for the dead. Relatives bore the stain whispered about in marketplaces and churchyards. A son or daughter might grow up under the shadow of a parent's execution. Their marriage prospects diminished, their every action weighed against the memory of that public disgrace. Death was supposed to close the book, but in these cases, it only wrote the story in darker ink, and through it all, the community gathered. Attendance at executions was expected, almost obligatory. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. Men joked uneasily. Women crossed themselves and murmured prayers. Vendors sold food and drink, turning the occasion into a grim fair. The condemned stood at the center, the object of every gaze, the lesson every parent would point to in warning. And when it was over, when the body hung slack or the ashes cooled, people would carry the image home, retelling it for years, until the details blurred into legend. Here in the heart of the labyrinth, you see the culmination of every humiliation, every ritual, every suspicion that came before. This is the final stage of medieval sexual punishment, the moment when the body is not only disciplined, but erased, yet made unforgettable through the very act of destruction. And as you listen to the fading toll of the bell, you understand that the cruelty was never truly about the crime. It was about the performance, the careful crafting of a spectacle that could satisfy the hunger for justice and the darker appetite for watching another human being brought low. Ahead, the bell falls silent. The next chamber is quieter, but not kinder. It is the place where punishment ends, but the shadow it casts stretches long into the lives of those left behind, the widows, the orphans, the survivors. And in that silence, you'll hear that medieval cruelty didn't stop with the execution. It lingered. It infected memory. It shaped the living as much as it destroyed the dead. The bell's echo fades into a hush, and for a moment the air feels lighter, but it is a false reprieve. You've stepped into the chamber where the sentence has already been carried out, the fire burned to ash, the gallows dismantled. The crowd has gone home, the marketplace has resumed its trade, the church bells have returned to their ordinary rhythm. But here in the quiet that follows, the punishment still breathes. It is no longer a matter of iron and rope. Now it lives in memory, in the altered lives of those who must carry what remains. When someone died under the stigma of a sexual crime, their family became part of the sentence. The medieval world believed that shame was not confined to the guilty, it clung like smoke to the household. A widow might find that friends no longer called at her door, that merchants charged her higher prices, that her children were kept at a distance from their playmates. Invitations to feast days and weddings quietly stopped arriving. In the tightly woven fabric of the village, such absence was as visible as any public shaming. Marriage prospects for the children of the condemned often vanished. A daughter whose father had been executed for rape or sodomy was seen as tainted, her bloodline suspect. A son might be treated as if the crime were hereditary, as though moral weakness could be passed like a birthmark. Families sometimes moved to distant towns in the hope of shedding the shadow, but the medieval world was smaller than it seemed, and word traveled faster than a cart could carry it. Even the property of the condemned was touched by their disgrace. Lands and goods could be confiscated by the crown or the local lord as part of the sentence, leaving the family impoverished overnight. If the estate was allowed to remain, it might be cursed in rumor travelers refusing to stay there, neighbors whispering of ghosts, livestock, falling ill and prompting murmurs that the land itself had been spoiled by sin. The shame was both material and spiritual, an inheritance no heir wished to receive. Widows bore the heaviest burden. In a society that prized female chastity as the bedrock of family honor, the wife of a condemned man was doubly suspect, first for having lived with him, and second for not having seen his guilt sooner. Some were accused outright of aiding in the crime, particularly in cases of adultery, sexual sorcery, or offenses involving minors. Even without formal charges, the suspicion could be enough to strip a woman of her social standing. Some widows turned to the church for refuge, entering convents where their past was known but not spoken of. Others tried to remarry quickly, seeking protection in a new household, but a marriage born of desperation was rarely kind. There were men willing to take in a woman under such circumstances, but the imbalance of power was stark. Her gratitude was assumed, her compliance expected. In too many cases, her body became part of the bargain. The children of the condemned sometimes found themselves drawn into a subtler form of punishment, constant reminders of the parents' disgrace. A boy might be given a cruel nickname that followed him into adulthood. A girl might be likened to her sinful mother or father. In moments of temper, her appearance or mannerisms treated as proof that the shame ran in her veins. These reminders could shape the course of their lives, narrowing their ambitions, bending their backs beneath an invisible weight. Neighbors played their part in keeping the memory alive. Medieval communities relied on oral tradition as much as on written record, and scandal was a favorite subject for repetition. The details might change in the retelling, but the gist remained: someone in that family had once crossed a line that no one should cross. At feast days in taverns, during long evenings by the hearth, the story would rise again, embroidered with new flourishes to keep it fresh. Children grew up hearing the tale told as a cautionary fable, never quite able to separate themselves from its lesson. The church, too, ensured that the stain remained. Priests might allude to the crime in sermons about lust, impurity, or the dangers of pride. Parish records which noted the cause of a person's execution could follow the family for generations. A grandchild seeking to join a guild or enter holy orders might find the old entry read aloud as a matter of record, the past closing doors before the present could even knock. Survivors also carried the invisible wounds of witnessing the spectacle itself. Wives and children often saw their loved one humiliated, paraded, or mutilated before death. Some were made to attend the execution as part of the punishment, a forced presence meant to magnify their grief and brand the lesson into their minds. The image of that final moment could haunt them for a lifetime, coloring every memory of the person they had known before. For victims of the crime itself, those harmed by the condemned, the aftermath was rarely straightforward. The execution might bring a sense of justice, but it also cemented their role in the story, tying them forever to an event they might wish to forget. In small communities, they too could be whispered about their reputations bound to the scandal. Some were pitied, others doubted, but few were truly left in peace. And still, the memory was used as a tool. Parents invoked it to warn their children against moral lapses. Elders used it to argue for stricter customs or harsher penalties. Local leaders might recall it in council debates about marriage laws, inheritance rights, or the treatment of strangers. In this way, the shame of one household became a public resource, a moral tale to be plucked from the shelf whenever it was useful. Sometimes the shadow stretched so far that it seemed to bend time. Years after the execution, a family might prosper, marry well, and appear to have put the past behind them only for a dispute or rivalry to resurrect the old accusation. A neighbor might mutter it under their breath during an argument, or a political opponent might slip it into a speech. The dead could not rise, but their disgrace could summon like a ghost to haunt the living. This lingering punishment was part of what made medieval sexual justice so complete. The execution was not the end. It was the beginning of a slow erosion, a kind of social exile that could last generations. In the eyes of the community, this was fitting. Sin, after all, was thought to leave a stain on the soul. Why should it not leave one on the family as well? And yet in the quiet moments, there were cracks in the stone. Some neighbors whispered sympathy to the widow, shared bread or milk when no one was watching. Some played with the children of the condemned without caring who saw. There were those who believed the sentence had been unjust or too severe, and who tried in small ways to keep the survivors from sinking entirely. But they moved carefully, for pity could be mistaken for guilt and kindness for complicity. You walk on through this chamber of silence, feeling the weight of lives altered long after the fire went out and the rope went slack. Ahead, the passage grows narrower still, the air damp with the breath of secrets. In the next chamber, you will see what happens when medieval punishment turns inward, when shame and suspicion creep into the private spaces of the home, shaping the most intimate parts of daily life. And there you will find that the reach of sexual discipline extended far beyond the public square. The passage narrows until it feels like a hallway inside a house low-beamed, shadowed with the faint smell of hearth smoke and rushes underfoot. This is no public square or gallows yard. Here the punishments are not proclaimed by criers or measured out by magistrates. They are administered quietly behind latched doors in the rooms where families eat, sleep, and pray. And in their own way, they can be as cruel and enduring as any public humiliation. The medieval household was not merely a dwelling. It was a microcosm of order, a place where the head of the family was both ruler and moral guardian. For most, that meant the man-husband, father, elder brother, whose authority was understood as God-given. It was his duty to maintain the chastity of the women under his roof, to keep them from scandal, to correct them if they strayed. The law, the church, and custom all reinforced this duty, and they provided a wide berth for how it might be fulfilled. Correction could take the form of physical punishment. A wife accused of flirting, lingering too long at market, or speaking with a neighbor's husband might be beaten in private. The blows were framed as discipline, an attempt to steer her back toward virtue. In practice, they were often an outlet for jealousy, suspicion, or anger, feelings given legitimacy by the belief that a man's honor was bound to his wife's perceived purity. Some punishments were meant less to injure than to control through humiliation. A husband might cut his wife's hair short, robbing her of a symbol of beauty and status. In certain regions, he might even force her to wear a coif or wimple indoors, a visible reminder of her penance, even when no one outside the family could see it. These symbols became part of daily life, woven into the hours like the chores and the prayers. Control extended beyond wives to daughters and sisters. Girls of marriageable age were often kept under watch, their movements restricted, their friendships monitored. If a rumor suggested impropriety, the family might confine the girl entirely, keeping her from church gatherings, markets, or visits to friends. She might be moved into the care of a strict aunt, or sent away to a convent until the gossip cooled and exile dressed as protection. Men, too, could find themselves disciplined within the household for sexual missteps. A son suspected of pursuing women beneath his station might be sent to live with relatives in another village, or apprenticed far from home, his departure explained as a matter of opportunity rather than shame. In harsher cases, a father might take a belt or rod to his son in front of the family, a performance meant to drive the lesson deep. In marriages where suspicion festered, control could become constant. A husband might demand to know where his wife had been at every hour of the day, question her about the people she spoke to, check her clothing for signs of disarray. He might inspect the bed linens for evidence of sexual activity he had not sanctioned, treating his own home as if it were a court of inquiry. Privacy, already scarce in medieval households, could vanish entirely under such scrutiny. Women, when they held authority, could wield it in their own ways. A mother might restrict her daughter's clothing, choosing heavier fabrics, higher necklines, or dull colors to avoid attracting male attention, or to keep a daughter from expressing herself in ways that could be read as boldness. An older sister acting as household mistress might forbid certain friendships, or insist on chaperonage for even the briefest walks. The goal was always to protect the family's honor, but the effect could be stifling, turning the home into a place of constant vigilance. Sexual discipline could also take the form of imposed religious observance. A suspected transgressor might be ordered to fast, to attend extra masses, or to make repeated confessions until the spiritual stain was considered washed away. In some households, these acts of penance were accompanied by the removal of small comforts, a softer bed, a share of wine at supper, a place near the hearth. Even meals could be made part of the correction, with the person set apart from the family table, a silent sign of their lowered standing. The threat of public exposure loomed over private discipline. A husband might warn his wife that if she did not mend her ways, he would take her before the parish priest or the village elders. A father might hint that he could send word to the neighbors, letting the rumor mill do its work. This fear kept many in line without a blow ever being struck, the knowledge that private shame could so easily become public spectacle. sex could itself be used as a tool of punishment or control. A husband might withhold intimacy as a way of asserting authority, making his wife earn the return of conjugal relations. In other cases, the reverse was true. The marital debt was invoked to force sex on a reluctant wife, her refusal treated as defiance rather than preference. The Church's teaching that spouses owed each other their bodies in marriage left little room for a woman to refuse without risking accusations of sin. In wealthier households where servants lived under the same roof, sexual discipline could turn outward toward the hired help. A maid suspected of improper behavior might be dismissed without references, ensuring she could find no respectable employment elsewhere. In harsher cases, she might be beaten before being sent away, her disgrace made visible to the household staff as a warning. A male servant accused of pursuing the lady of the house could find himself thrown into the street beaten, or even hauled before local officials. Even the architecture of the home could be bent to the work of control. Some houses had small, easily secured rooms where a family member could be locked for hours or days. These spaces, sometimes called closets or inner chambers, could serve as a place of solitary reflection, but in practice they were often used as confinement for disobedience. A woman kept there might be given only bread and water, her isolation meant to break her will. The emotional atmosphere created by such measures could linger long after the punishment ended. A wife might carry the habit of silence into every conversation, fearing that a careless word would spark fresh suspicion. A daughter might learn to avoid eye contact with strangers, to walk quickly past men in the street, to hold her body as if it were something that might betray her. A son might grow cautious in his friendships, wary of any bond that could be read as improper. These homebound disciplines rarely made it into official records, but they shaped lives as surely as the public rituals and legal sentences outside the door. They taught that sexuality was dangerous, that desire was a threat, that one's body was a thing to be watched, controlled, and possibly punished. And because they happened in the private sphere, they could be repeated indefinitely, unchecked by the limits of law or the gaze of outsiders. You pass through the low-ceilinged hallway toward a narrow door at the far end. Beyond it, you can hear the faint sound of water, a trickle, a splash, the murmur of people gathered near a stream. The air grows damp, the smell of earth and moss rising around you. In the next chamber, you will see how medieval sexual discipline could play out not in the home or the town square, but in the liminal spaces between the thresholds where the community met nature and where punishment could be staged against the backdrop of the open world. The door opens and you step out into the damp night air. Overhead, a thin moon glows through slow-moving clouds, its light glancing off the silver skin of water in the distance. You hear the stream more clearly now, the low rush of current, the occasional slap of water against stone. This is no grand river, but it is wide enough to bear witness. And here on the margins of the village, medieval sexual discipline finds another stage, one that merges the elements with the human appetite for ritualized shame. The water ordeal was among the oldest and most enduring of these punishments. In its simplest form, it was a test the accused was cast into the stream or pond, bound in some fashion, and judged by how the water received them. Float, and you were guilty, the pure water rejected your sinful body. Sink, and you were innocent, though you might drown before the lesson could be appreciated. The logic was cruel, but it carried the authority of both superstition and tradition. For sexual offenses, the ordeal was often staged for maximum spectacle. Women accused of adultery or promiscuity might be stripped to a thin shift, sometimes wet beforehand, so that the fabric clung and revealed and tied at the wrists or elbows. Villagers gathered along the banks, their voices carrying over the rippling surface as the accused was led into the current. The cold shocked the breath from her lungs, and the weight of the water clung to her clothes like another set of chains. Men suspected of sexual crimes could face the ordeal in a harsher form. Some were bound hand and foot before being thrown in their struggles interpreted as signs of guilt. Others were made to wade into the deepest part stones tied to their waists to test their endurance. Whether they swam or sank, the crowd judged them according to the story they had already chosen to believe. The ordeal was not about truth, it was about reaffirming the moral script the village had already agreed upon. In certain regions, the ordeal became a festival in itself. Vendors might set up near the banks selling bread ale or roasted chestnuts to the gathered onlookers. Children played at the water's edge, tossing pebbles while waiting for the main event. The accused, shivering in the shallows, became part of a tableau that was half fairground, half execution ground. The mix of laughter, gossip, and solemn pronouncement and created a dissonance that was uniquely medieval cruelty wrapped in the trappings of community life. Water was not the only element pressed into service. Earth, too, played its part. In some places, a man accused of seducing a married woman might be made to dig a pit on the edge of the village, a hole just large enough for him to stand in up to his chest. The villagers would then fill it back in around him, patting the soil until he was buried to the neck. He might be left there for hours, the sun or rain beating down dogs, sniffing at his face, flies settling on his skin. The imagery was unmistakable. He was being planted as a warning, the earth itself holding him in place. For women, there were punishments tied to the open fields. A suspected adulteress might be driven beyond the last cottages and made to walk the boundary lines of the village barefoot, accompanied by a small crowd singing mocking verses. Sometimes she was forced to carry a heavy load, a sack of grain, a bundle of wood, as a symbol of the burden her sin had placed on the community. The trek could last hours, the cold or heat gnawing at her body, while every step traced her exile. Bridges and crossroads were favored sites for symbolic humiliation. A man judged guilty of unmanly conduct might be made to stand on a bridge for an entire day wearing a sign that described his offense. Passers-by could spit, jeer, or strike him as they crossed. Women might be stationed at crossroads with baskets of stones at their feet, forced to hand a stone to every person who passed a silent invitation to join in the punishment. These places were chosen for their symbolism, crossroads, and bridges were liminal spaces, thresholds, between one state and another, perfect for marking the transition from respectability to disgrace. In coastal towns, sexual offenders sometimes faced the humiliation of the tidal stake. Bound to a post driven into the sand, the accused was left to stand as the tide came in, the water climbing slowly around their legs. The intent was rarely to drown. The stake was set far enough inland for the tide to rise only to the waist or chest, but the cold, the isolation, and the spectacle left their mark. Watching the water creep upward was a slow-motion ordeal, the minutes stretched thin by the gaze of those who gathered on the shore. Even the forest edges could become a stage. A woman accused of luring men into sin might be led to the tree line, stripped of her shoes and cloak, and sent into the woods with nothing but her shift. She was expected to spend the night there, exposed to the cold and the sounds of animals. In the morning, she might return on her own, humbled, filthy, and stiff with chill, or be fetched back by villagers who would remark on how the forest had burned her pride away. These punishments drew power from their settings. The open air stripped away the intimacy of a home or the containment of a courtroom. Here, under the sky, the accused seemed smaller, more vulnerable. and the community larger, more united in its judgment. Nature itself was drafted into the work of shame, the water's chill, the earth's weight, the wind's bite, all part of the sentence. And yet there was something deeper at work in these liminal punishments. They were not only about the accused, they were about reaffirming the boundaries of the community, to walk the village's edge, to stand at its gates, to be planted in its soil. These were symbolic acts reminding everyone present that moral order was tied to place, and that to violate that order was to risk being cast out into the spaces beyond. For the accused, the memory of such ordeals could linger long after the bruises faded. The bend in the stream, the rough boards of a certain bridge, the shadow of a stand of trees. Each could become a reminder of the day when all eyes were upon them, when they were marked as other. And for those who watched, the landscape itself became a map of morality, dotted with the sites where sin had been named and shamed. The murmuring of the stream follows you as you move on, but ahead, another sound rises softer, stranger. It is the creak of wood, the low groan of rope, the shuffle of feet in a circle. The air thickens with the scent of pitch and tallow, and you realize you are approaching the final, most enclosed space of all the chamber, where the community gathers not in daylight or in the open, but under the shadow of secrecy to bind its own moral order in rites that mix punishment ceremony and a final reckoning. The sound of water fades behind you, replaced by the steady creak of timber and the low, synchronized shuffle of feet. You've stepped into a chamber lit by noonday gloom, the kind that seeps in through shutters left half closed. The air is thick with the scent of pitch wax and bodies pressed close. Here the community gathers not to jeer in the open air, but to seal its judgments in the intimacy of ritual, to enact punishments that are half ceremony, half condemnation, wrapped in a shroud of secrecy. Some of these gatherings took place in guild halls, others in the upper rooms of taverns or in the chapter houses of churches. They were not trials in the formal sense, though. They might borrow the trappings of one: a table for the judges, benches for those called to watch a symbolic object placed in the center. The accused would be brought in quietly, often under the cover of darkness, if the matter was considered scandalous enough to merit discretion. But once inside, there was nothing quiet about the proceeding. The charges were recited aloud, heavy with moral language. A man might be accused of defiling the marriage bed or bringing unclean practices into the house of God. A woman might be named as one who invited lewdness or turned the hearts of men from their lawful wives. The words were not chosen for accuracy so much as for their weight, each syllable like a stone added to the pile against the accused. Then came